So I think we're going to make a start. Thank you very, very much for tuning in to our geography seminar today. It's really great to see so many of you, especially right at this end of the semester. And yeah, I hope that you're coping with lockdown 2, or even 4 even. Before we begin, we must acknowledge that we're on Indigenous land. Here in the north of the city, I'm on Wurundjeri country. And of course, it's really important that we pay our respects to elders past and present. So today it gives me great pleasure to welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Chantal Carr. Chantal is an ARC DECRA Award holder in the School of Geography and Sustainable Communities at the University of Wollongong. She's an interdisciplinary social scientist with a background in architecture and urban planning, and she has a PhD in human geography. Her research looks at the capacities of workers and households to negotiate change in energy-intensive sectors and regions, and this has been achieved through empirical work on industries such as steelmaking, coal, and the built environment that are at the heart of the carbon economy in urban and regional Australia. And conceptually, her work develops feminist and post-capitalist perspectives that consider all forms of work as valuable, whether that's in the home and community or outside the bounds of the enterprise. So today, Chantal is going to be talking with us about maintaining lives, care in an industrial city. She'll be speaking for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have time for questions and discussion. So if you do have questions for Chantal, please feel free to submit them at any time by pressing the Q&A button on your screen and adding your question there. And we'll collate those as we go along. Otherwise, when we get to the Q&A session, you can use the raise hand function and ask your question directly. Finally, I'd also like to just advise that we are recording today's presentation. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Chantal.
Thanks, David. Okay, here we go with the part that's really challenging, which is the screen sharing stuff. Before you disappear, I'll just make sure we've got this okay. So I'm going to leave those icons up along the bottom, because if I don't do that, I can't see my dual screen happening here, which is kind of essential. Is that okay? Are we all great? Perfect. Okay. Thank you, and thanks to the School of, oh gosh, you've changed, haven't you? The School of Geography at Melbourne for having me. Thanks also to Anna, Candice and Ariane, who I've been in contact with in the background. It's really nice to be amongst lots of people that I know down there. I am underneath Jira, Mount Kira, which is the mountain that you see there on the left, our beloved escarpment here in the Illawarra. And this has been a place of learning for Dharawal, Wadi and Yuin people for millennia. It's unceded land, as is all land in what we know today as Australia. And it's important for me to acknowledge as a settler academic that I continue to benefit from the displacement of Aboriginal people from this country. And without this truth-telling, you know, there can really be no path forward for our relationships with this place. So today I want to revisit some PhD work, and that seems like a long while ago now. I'm not sure if Leslie's here, but Leslie was one of my co-supervisors along with Chris Gibson. Part of this is because I know you're all in lockdown, and you know, I can't express what do you say other than it's shit. So what I wanted to do was to really talk to a bit of a good news story, a bit of a backyard story, I guess, that responds to the situation that I think, you know, that you're in. So I wanted to start with, hang on, where are we? Here we go. I wanted to start with this little story. So Charlie's wife, Laura, confides in me as she places my cup of tea down and apologetically offers me a slice of very brown cake. She fears that she's losing her culinary skills because it's rare that she cooks these days. And with a lot of laughter, she describes how Charlie rarely entered the kitchen other than to make tea during the preceding 20 years of their marriage. Yet now he's with great gusto taken up the mantle of the household cook. And she's often frustrated by the mess that he makes, but for the moment she's happy to enjoy this reversal of roles and the rewards of his labour. 3 years ago, Charlie was an electrical maintenance supervisor at the Port Kembla Steelworks. And over the course of a 40-year career, he had taken on a range of roles, moving from apprentice through to leading hand in the 1970s, undertaking shift repair work and becoming a foreman in the 1980s, and moving into positions of increasing responsibility. When he retired in 2011, Charlie was responsible for all of the electrical and control equipment at the hot strip mill, a role that came with lots of responsibility and pressure. Charlie later tells me that his newfound enthusiasm for cooking found its genesis in the intersection between the extra time that his retirement provided him with and the passing of both of his parents. So through the work of gardening and cooking, he feels like he's able to connect with his Italian heritage. For example, he's spent many long afternoons over the last few years perfecting time-intensive specialties that his mother used to make, like gnocchi that he's making here. He's proud of how well it's received by his children and grandchildren, who are often involved in the work of making it. They were only infants when their great-grandmother died, and Charlie feels like he's now carrying on a food tradition that they'll remember fondly. Several months later, I'm reminded of my conversations with Charlie while I'm out driving. On the radio, health geographer Laurie Brown is being interviewed about a newly released report from the National Centre for Social and Economic Modelling. Brown is talking about the hot button policy issue of raising the retirement age. In a speech delivered just prior to the 2015 budget, the then Federal Treasurer Joe Hockey announced that by 2035, those born after 1965 would have to work until they're 70 before they're eligible for an aged pension. Brown is arguing that this move, predicated on increasing the productive capacity in the economy, overlooks fundamental questions about how societies value all the other kinds of labour that's done by those who are no longer engaged in waged work. So caring for elderly parents and grandchildren, volunteering, and growing food are some of the examples that she cites. And I'm reminded of Charlie and of his wife's confessions during the interview with Brown, because every time I contact him, he fits in conversations with me amidst exactly this kind of work. So Charlie took voluntary retirement at the age of 59, and at many points in our conversations, he has exclaimed that he's busier now than he was ever while working at the steelworks. And I hear these same sentiments repeated often during the time I spend in garages and sheds with industrial maintenance and repair workers. So in the context of Brown's comments, many of the retired participants are very busy doing exactly the kind of labour that's long been recognised by feminist geographers, by people like Linda McDowell, as undervalued and underpaid. It's the nominally invisible reproductive work, as Cindy Katz describes it, the fleshy, messy, indeterminate stuff of everyday life that enables capital accumulation to continue. So this paper is drawn from fieldwork that was undertaken for my PhD, which was an ethnography of maintenance and repair work at the Port Kembla Steelworks. And the broader project really looked at how repair and maintenance culture transcends the boundaries of paid work, where many of the same methods and practices, the same materials, tools, and skills can be readily found within other spaces like the home and community. And this approach was inspired by a feminist body of work that's really emphasised how value is assigned to work unevenly, depending on where activities take place and who does them. So in this paper, I want to extend this perspective further by examining the work participants do beyond the paid workplace through the lens of care. In the Illawarra region, workers have long taken great care of machinery, of material goods, and often of each other throughout their paid working lives. But moving the emphasis on these activities further into the home and community starts to highlight how care itself is not gendered, but rather comes to be so through the structures and spaces in which it proceeds. Oh, too fast. So the paper is in part inspired by McDowell's study of the transition into work for young working class men. But here I'm concerned with how participants have negotiated their transition from the masculinized identities that have characterized their long working lives, and how they've reconciled with visions of an everyday future that is somewhat more tender and hopeful. And you can probably hear some of Leslie's resonances in there. Such futures are expressed through embracing the work of caring for things and others. So growing, cooking food, maintaining homes and helping other people maintain theirs, caring for extended family, elderly parents, making time for grandchildren. If we view these through the lens of a productive disruption, this moment of profound life change offers an opportunity to push back against some of the more persistent binaries of gender, age, and autonomy that dominate our hegemonic constructions of work and value. So retirement has been a challenging proposition for many of the participants, though perhaps the one who articulates it most clearly is Carl. I first visit Carl late one winter afternoon in 2014 at his home, and it's cold and dark outside as we wrap up our walk around his house and retire to the living room, where his wife is sitting in front of a wood stove, watching their grandson play on a rug. And I start to ask Carl about his experiences of retirement and how they've met with his expectations. And when I ask whether the adjustment has been challenging, it's Julie who responds first, and you can see the exchange here, though Carl is very quick to agree with Julie's observations. In this conversation, Carl is referring to working regular double shifts, a common practice during down days and shutdown periods at the plant. And he talks at length about his passion for his work and its cultures of problem solving. I get the impression that part of the reason that he has found retirement so challenging is that level of enjoyment that he's derived from his work. So Carl tells me that he was delighted when his son chose to follow him into the trade because it meant that he could talk about work in his retirement and stay connected with that workplace culture. So Carl's passion for his work provides a very different perspective on the common misconception that industrial work is only ever a constraining factor on a more enduring goal of leisure, that you only work under duress. And this is, I would argue, a persistently middle-class assumption about industrial work, that workers would always rather be doing something else. And it often stems from, I think, a lack of understanding of what contemporary industrial workers do, because we make these assumptions, probably based on a Bruce Springsteen song, that they're still shoveling coal into furnaces. And for repair and maintenance workers such as Carl, enjoyment stems from both the technical and the social aspects of the work that they do. So distinctions between work and leisure are often obscured, where home projects are brought into work while tools, materials, skills cross the bounds from paid work out into the home and community. And these transgressions really constitute quite a positive identity affirming experience for those whose skills are as useful in everyday life as they are in the workplace. So the participants in this project began their apprenticeships at Port Kembla during a period of prosperity, post-war industrial prosperity. Positions of increasing and increasingly specialised responsibility meant that many participants remained immune to the many rounds of redundancy that happened during the 1980s and 90s. So when the maintenance function was entirely outsourced in 2001, their roles and the deep accumulated knowledges they held were retained by the company. And that's a position of privilege that it's important to acknowledge. But the experiences of these workers provide a basis from which to approach the complexity of conflicting emotions surrounding retirement, which includes this simultaneous sense of both sadness and liberation. And this kind of texture alerts us to the ambivalence of redundancy more broadly, and the broad brush nature of some of the meta-narratives that accompany industrial redundancy. So for Carl, Charlie, Bert, and David, the event of retiring had long been planned for, but it kind of arrived quicker. It was very quickly executed. It arrived quicker than they'd actually ideally hoped for. And the feelings of shock that were themselves often unexpected, they were shocked that they were shocked, were soon replaced by a slow period of adjustment, and a period where the days were suddenly empty but filled with tasks. Sometimes partners chimed in during interviews with their expectations for work around the home. One partner, who asked not to be identified, said, "I just wish he'd look after his own backyard before he gets out there and is social and helping every Tom, Dick and Harry around the place." A key part of Carl's structuring of his day in order to cope with such temporal disconnects was the use of a diary, and that's what this excerpt is here. Since his retirement, Carl had used a diary to record jobs that required doing around the home and commitments that he'd made to helping others. And this diary, it turned out, had also become a useful tool for managing some of the anxieties around early retirement. By far the most valuable means by which workers have found to provide structure and support for themselves was the establishment of a coffee club. And I should say that there were 18 participants in this ethnography, all of whom were members of this coffee club. Though some participants, such as David and Peter, openly admitted they never would have sought out more formal membership of a social network, both are regular attendees at the coffee club that meets at a different spot each Friday. And the selection of a suitable cafe is the subject of lots of emailing during the week. Over time, the coffee club has grown in size. I think at the moment it's probably at about 40 people. And when I asked Carl to tell me a little bit more about what the coffee club means to him, he talks about the different discussions and themes that dominate their weekly meetings. And so it's evident from this quote here that the coffee club goes well beyond the conversations that would have dominated their shared working lives. Long-standing knowledge of each other's families had led to some really broad-ranging discussions, including the challenges of caring for elderly parents and grandchildren at the same time. And these meetings continue to flourish today, 10 years after the 4 core members initially retired. And this network is really an example of the endurance of those social relationships that have been formed through extended periods of shared work experience. And I know we can all only hope for that kind of long-standing work that they've enjoyed over their careers. So it's at one of the early coffee club meetings that someone announced their plans to construct some raised garden beds in which to grow some food. And this in turn gave rise to a really enthusiastic discussion that gathered pace very quickly, and for several participants became a focus within the home in those early days of transitioning to retirement. Going out into the backyard to work on the vegetable gardens became an important task for people like Carl and Charlie. It evoked a sense of achievement and meted feelings of loss of purpose by providing them with a tangible task during the early weeks and months in which to recenter their lives on the home. There were also other connections to their migrant heritages. And here I drew a little bit on the work of Sonia Graham and John Connell, where both described growing up with a back garden used for copious food production. Now, Jack, on the other hand, had always grown food, but retirement meant he could increase his productivity. So on a tour of his garden, Jack tells me that he'd retired prematurely without substantial superannuation savings. And now he used the garden to provide a measure of subsistence for himself. He actually needed the food he grew in order to live. And his thrifty ways of living and confidence in adapting his material skills to provide for his family had been an integral part of his decision to retire at 55. So you can see there that Jack's rigged up a pumped irrigation system from that sloping garden down to the bottom up to the back of his own accord using the skills that he has. Jack points out the degree of competition between some of the food growing participants, illustrating some of the emergent masculinities that started to coalesce around these new activities of growing within the group. And this was further facilitated by the regular weekly meetings of the coffee club. So for Charlie and Jack, substantial proportions of their gardens were given over to fruit and vegetable cultivation following their retirement. This growth in capacity was incremental. It was slow and brought on by building up these garden beds and converting to areas of the garden to food production as needed. And there was a measure of quite inadvertent sustainability, borrowing from Hitchings, Collins and Day there, to these activities. Their long gestation meant that they could often use scrap materials sourced from around the community, but the gardens also increased in size only as their confidence and their skills grew. So once they'd started to gain satisfaction from growing produce, some participants had turned their attention to other kinds of food. Several had built sheds and coops to house chickens, often working with scrap materials, as you can see here, or what was to hand. I know it looks kind of punitive. Over the course of the project, Charlie made several modifications to his coop as he got to know the behaviours and preferences of his chickens, probably unhappy in this punitive shed, including repositioning the egg box and extending the run, a bit more pleasant environment there. At one point, he disassembled the original run entirely and built a completely new version, again, entirely out of scrap. Jack had also extended his chicken coop and had famously experimented at length with this innovative feeding system built from old industrial pulleys and scrap bits of PVC pipe and metal. Jack had helpfully annotated a photo of the chicken feeder system to explain how it worked to me. The feeder system was the subject of much laughter amongst the group, and Charlie and Carl had continued experimenting with similar models. One aspect of these increasingly successful levels of suburban food production was an enthusiasm for supplying produce to family, friends, and neighbours. So my repeat visits to different participants saw me leaving with a wide range of produce, fruit, vegetables, eggs, and as I spent time with them, increasing amounts of time with them, cooked food such as bread, fermented cabbage, pickled beetroot, tomato passata. It was a productive, empirical gathering exercise. But this demonstrates the strong engagement participants have with economies of generosity and sharing. In some cases, there was a cross-cultural aspect to these economies of sharing. So for example, Charlie and Marco both spoke of their experiences at length growing up in Italian and Slovenian cultures that have always strongly valued food production here in the Illawarra. But for others, it was also a matter of pure excess and what to do with excess. So for these small households, children have left home and they're often two-people households, it would be impossible to eat all the food that was being produced. So sharing with kin had become a way to avoid waste, which in turn can be linked to notions of abundance and thrift. And again, drawing on Leslie's great work in that space. But amongst all participants, there was a definite preference for informal networks of interdependence, which were tied to existing connections such as friends, neighbours, family, and each other. So for most, the idea of formal organised volunteering wasn't an option. They didn't want to participate in those kinds of formal networks. Rather, they sought out the strong local connections that had often arisen through living in place over extended periods of time, and the opportunity to reconnect with these networks during a period of their lives when time wasn't the most valuable currency. And there's resonances between these networks of interdependence and what McDowell's call for a more socialist ideal of solidarity and mutuality between networks of individuals. Such networks illustrate the merit in returning to these old industrial cultures with a slightly kind of oblique lens. Here, a feminist lens that foregrounds that invisible work within the enterprise, and that's another part of this project, as well as valuing the work that proceeds in the home and community. A feminist framework opens up new perspectives on those legacies of solidarity and interdependence that really characterize the industrial city. So for the workers in this study, there have long been opportunities to find other economies of thrift and generosity and sharing within the niches and enclaves created by hegemonic industrial capital. And that such networks continue to flourish outside of the bounds of formal collective institutions, things like unions, points to the strength of those political microcultures based on care and inclusion that continue to resonate through the industrial city. But despite the fact that they didn't accompany me to any interviews, I quickly learned that my own children were going to become integral to my research relationships when I was consistently asked about them during fieldwork. So more than half of the participants spent some of their week caring for grandchildren. They're interested in talking about my care arrangements and seemed happy to learn that my parents also took on some of the caring responsibilities while I worked and studied. So during my first meeting with Carl and Julie, we talk about the important role that grandparenting plays in his life. And the themes here are common: the high cost, the inflexibility, and the difficulty of accessing the privatised system of early childhood care in Australia, which meant that some saw formal care as an unnecessary and wasteful expense, and they were happy to volunteer a weekly commitment. Lots picked up, quite a few picked up older grandchildren from school on a regular basis, while parents were working sort of regular, what we previously called regular office hours. And this everyday caring for grandchildren is an important aspect of the lives of older Australians. And it's exactly the kind of work that Laurie Brown spoke of during the radio interview that sparked my interest in care. Towards the end of our interview, Jack and I looked through dozens of photos of the projects that he's completed over the years, and his passion for timber work, and in particular timber toys, becomes obvious. So though their children are now teenagers, Cheryl ushers us all into the spare bedroom where she pulls some of these out of the wardrobe. So what we see here, sorry, I've just realised that's great. I've deleted a massive chunk in trying to bring this down and now it's all gone. So what we see here, let's go off the cuff. What we see here is, you know, this was one of many. She had a whole cupboard. They had a whole cupboard full of these beautiful timber toys that Jack had spent time with building for their grandchildren over the years. And there was so much delight in that interview of revisiting their toys. Now, it's not all a positive story, because there was at times a certain amount of discontent around such responsibilities. So the incompatibility of ageing bodies with the youthful exuberance of small children, I'm feeling that now, was commonly raised as an issue. So too was being locked into these daily and term-based routines that were aligned with school schedules when they were at a stage of life when they were financially and physically able to travel. But nevertheless, most were prepared to devote some proportion of their working week to care and to development of young children. Beyond caring for grandchildren, participants also spoke about caring for elderly parents as well. So Charlie's wife, Laura, who had worked in aged care prior to her own retirement, referred to the group more broadly as part of the sandwich generation, and I know that's been used in a range of contexts. When I asked her what she meant by this, she explained that the boomers were the first generation whose parents had lived far beyond the age of 70, while their children had married and started families later in life, which meant that their grandchildren were simultaneously younger. The sandwich generation, according to Laura, were often enrolled to care for both generations at the same time and had found themselves prematurely exhausted as a result. Many of us might have different feelings about that, I don't know. But Jack articulates this particularly well in one exchange where he talks about caring for elderly parents and his grandchildren at the same time, that quote that you see there on the left. On the right, Trevor, meanwhile, talks about taking care of his elderly mother, who continues to live on her own at 93. And he describes there taking her out shopping on a weekly basis, something that he now has time to do now that he's not in paid employment. So this paper began by raising questions about how societies value all the work that's done outside of waged labour and how this work might be valued differently. In this case, the case study that I've just gone through, this includes the work of supporting colleagues as they transition from paid work to retirement, the work of caring for others in families and in communities through growing, sharing and cooking food, caring for grandchildren and elderly parents, often at the same time. These many different forms of caring illustrate the importance of acknowledging care in all its forms as work, as labour. Moreover, they illustrate that care is elemental to sustaining relationships and social infrastructures, yet it often exists outside of the conceptions of value that come to matter most in a market context. For some industrial workers, retirement opened up an extended moment of potential where persistent binaries of age, gender and autonomy became slightly more open to renegotiation. So men who had spent their entire working careers in the industrial workplace lost a part of their identity when they stopped work, but gained new subjectivities as retirees whose lives became recentered on the home and community. Now, all this is not to say that retirement changes gender roles beyond recognition. Tensions around the gender divisions of labour shift, but as far as I could see, they didn't radically change in many households. For the vast majority of households in this project, women partners were still doing most of the housework and household organisation. The divisions of labour also suggest that men tended to take on the work of projects that interested them, such as special occasion cooking and outdoor projects, rather than the more mundane everyday work, things like washing clothes, and they're building on the work of Organo, Head and Waite, who had similar findings. Finally, through the experiences of industrial workers in retirement, though the experiences of industrial workers in retirement are in some ways common, in many ways they're also variable. In the context of working class politics, experiences of ceasing work are often presented as hegemonic and remove agency from workers. But the reality is that some workers have been able to cease work at a time of their own choosing and with living conditions that might even be more favourable than those they experienced while working. This lends these workers the economic, social and material capacity to construct a new identity and a space of belonging, though of course this raises new questions about those who might be unable to do so. Often the newfound availability of time offers space to develop new social connections, both within the family and household and more broadly across the community. And that's something that I didn't really touch on in this talk, but again is part of the broader project. Importantly, their material skills offer a conduit through which to perform this work and make these connections, in the process opening up some alternative masculinities beyond these hegemonic conceptions of paid work as a source and a site of value. All right, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you. Stop screen sharing. Where are we?
Thanks so much,
Thanks,
Chantal.
everyone.
Thanks, that was fantastic. Just a really, really inspiring paper on what's a really compelling and obviously very, very timely topic. I really like especially how your work is more broadly rethinking the very idea and remit of industrial labour for geographers, and we got a really clear sense of that today. And I think it's also given us a lot to think about in light of current rounds of, I guess, employment loss relating to COVID-19. And I think so many of the things that you've drawn attention to around, for example, the persistence of skills and social relationships and networks feel really, really personal here. So thank you. We've got a couple of questions already in the Q&A. So I will read them out. Although if you'd prefer to present the question yourself, feel free. Okay, so I've got a question from Andrew, who enjoyed the presentation. He says, I'm just wondering about how the notion of home could be unpacked with the empirical material. My understanding of the presentation and the recent transactions article, which is excellent, is that much of the work that men do takes place on land marked as residential, but actually outside the home, such as in gardens, sheds and garages. Just wondered if being outside the home was significant in any way for how participants perform their masculinities.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the claiming of the outdoor domain, right, which kind of reinforces that what you would expect, I think, of masculinities. I think there was in another chapter, I explore these sort of in-between spaces, I guess, you know, these sheds and gardens and backyards, garages, things like that, as a kind of in-between space. And I think, you know, they are very masculinized, but at the same time, I think they do lend themselves to where I think they're interesting is as a space of experimentation. So, you know, the space within a suburban, we often hear about the suburban landscape as very sort of bland and, you know, nothing's really happening across that landscape. But in this case, there's lots of experimenting going on in those garages and sheds and backyards. So I think that has implications in our city, certainly for planning. There's lots of slightly illegal activities going on in those sheds and backyards. Yeah, I guess I'm rambling here. That's a classic first question, right, where you're rambling. They are, I think, very masculine spaces. Often you'll find partners are either excluded from them by participants or self-exclude from these spaces. I'm not going there, that's their space, which I think is a really interesting gendered take on those spaces. But I think where they become more interesting is as a site of suburban experimentation, sort of out of view of you know, authority in any way. And I think, again, that kind of talks back to the idea of being in the niches and folds of industrial capital, that you sort of tucked away sort of beyond these big narratives of industrialism. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. Okay, so our second question is from Trent, who asks, does your research speak to the in brackets valuation of these worker skills over a longer time scale? I'm thinking of whether longer process of deindustrialization in the region might have led to devaluation relative to other skills, or if neoliberal consumer culture might lead grandchildren to see handcrafted toys as embarrassing symbols of poverty.
Yeah, that's it's not so much what I did touch on that in this project, but it's something that I've certainly taken up in so my DECRA project now is looking at household responses in coal worker families, so in mining families mostly. But there is an issue around I think around those longer timescales of de-skilling, and where I think it is really interesting is in another project I'm working on with Chris Gibson and Andrew Warren. We're looking at Port Kembla, and there's a lot of talk at the moment about Port Kembla becoming a hydrogen hub. I think that's the word. There's a lot of sort of political talk going on around that. And in a couple of meetings that I've been a part of over the last couple of months, people have said, we've got the skills infrastructure here to be able to support new industries, you know, whether it be renewables, hydrogen, all of that stuff. There is that skills infrastructure here. And I'm kind of cautious around that because I feel like it's, you know, it's too little too late, I guess, is my sense of it. I don't want to say that in a kind of anti-hopeful sense, but, you know, lots of the infrastructure around these skills has, you know, these workers have often retired. But I think unless we can sort of access those knowledges, the ones that are still remaining, we're in a little bit of trouble about, you know, how we move forward as an industrial region. I don't think the idea that regions like Wollongong, Port Kembla, you know, down in Victoria, Geelong, I don't think those regions are necessarily going to completely change from being industrial regions. And I think there's a real question to be had around the skills base in those regions. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's so interesting. And even that very concept of skill infrastructure that you see in the policy stuff, you know, your work really gives us pause to reflect on, well, what does that actually mean? You know, is it people? Is it people and, you know, their surrounds, their materials? I think you give us some really different answers to those quite on the face of it simple concepts like skill infrastructure. Okay, our next question is from Vicky, who says, wonderful talk, Chantal. She said, I really love the way you talk through the interview vignettes and introduced us to the people you work alongside. I'd love to hear your further reflections of the relations between time and care. This seemed particularly personal given the life stage your participants were at given their early retirement. Do you think the capacity to engage in these co-constituted forms of care would be different for those at other times in the life course? So another question on temporality.
Yeah, look, it takes time to care. I think that's, you know, it's a very simple point. And yes, certainly the life stage these participants were at was absolutely relevant to that moment of being able to care in this way. Having said that, I think over the course of their working lives, when they were, you know, often working sort of 50 or 60-hour weeks, you know, their capacities to care were still there. It was just that they were caring for machinery and for processes and for keeping a plant running. I don't know how many people are aware of the sort of slow decline, I guess, of Port Kembla in terms of workplace numbers, but these participants had spent probably the last, well, certainly since the 1980s, making do with less, I guess, is the term that I use. And you know, that they were caring, but they were caring within the workplace in a very invisible way as repair and maintenance workers. So I think, yeah, that there is absolutely a, I think it's a, you know, it's a really direct correlation between that idea of time and care. And, you know, that's part of, I think, what we need to unpack here. And I think it's, you know, it's part of the COVID moment as well, right? That we all may suddenly have time to care, some of us more than others. I know, you know, those of you who are working at home while also caring for children at the moment, you know, working in this sector, you might be teaching or you might be researching, your capacities to care are probably really challenged at the moment. So you know, I think these are the broader conversations that we need to have as a society, is really recognising that it does take time to offer that care in a range of different contexts.
Great, thank you. So a reflection from Leslie, who says in the chat, so much of what you say is relevant to impending academic retirement. But perhaps, Chantal, you could also say a bit about how your own Steelworks involvement facilitated the ethnography.
Thanks, Leslie. Yeah, so the origins of this project, I just realised this is actually the first time I've talked about this work in an Australian context. It's really nice to talk to people. I think this culture, you know, there's a certain localness to some of this culture. So it is nice to get people's reflections and their personal reflections on how they have their own stories. But my story is that this project started back in the early 1990s. I had a human geography offer to UNSW in one hand and an offer to do an apprenticeship at the Steelworks in the other hand. And that came about because I had a bit of a rebellious moment and flounced off to become an apprentice electrician. So I worked at Port Kembla for 4 years, training to be an electrician back in the mid-1990s. And so returning to, or coming to do a PhD, was a story of knowing those workers were there, realising in some of my undergraduate study that no one had ever really sort of focused on repair and maintenance in an industrial workplace. And it was a process of kind of uncovering a story, I guess, that that I'd been invested in, you know, 15 years earlier. So yeah, I often say I can't tell this story one more time anymore. But yeah, it was a very personal, you know, start to the research.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Chantal. It really helps to understand, I think, this audience as well. We've got an interesting question from Ross in the chat, who says, also love the talk and how you talk about the different kinds of care found in or near the home. Seems like the theme of caring for non-humans like gardens and chickens was something that came up very often in your work. So we'll ask, how did you find that care for non-humans strengthened or even widened the care networks in your study?
Yeah, wow. Look, absolutely. You know, there was care for non-humans. I've got to say, at some point, you have to limit things. I'm surrounded by some amazing people who do non-human, more than human, you know, Jenny Atchison, Leah Gibbs, people who do lots of work in that space. I got too scared to go there. It's the first time we had lots of informal lunchroom discussions about this work and about, you know, the kind of backyard work that went on. I admit I kind of didn't go there, but reflecting on it, you know, a few years down the track, I think that's certainly a perspective that that workers, yeah, I think they really did. I guess they came with a very practical sense of the world. They came to the backyard and to the garden, to caring for animals with a very sort of, you know, they think with their hands. These are people who have spent lifetimes and were originally trained to think with their hands. And I think that probably connecting with your work as well, David, on a very sensory level, that gives a very different perspective on how you engage with other, with non-humans and more than humans. So it's not something that I looked at specifically, basically because I was too overawed by people doing great work in that space. But yeah, I think it is really an interesting perspective on, you know, the different skills that you bring into that space.
Great, thank you. And I think we can all certainly appreciate that sense of, oh my goodness, there are so many choices here. I've actually got to make some choices and figure out what it is I want to focus on.
Just in full disclosure, I mean, I spent 6 years doing this. You know, part of that was doing my PhD, and I always want to say that because people often say, you know, how did you publish? Leslie has full view of this, as does Chris, who was my supervisor, Chris Gibson. You know, it was extended through having children, through, you know, periods of RAing on Households Project, the Access Oscar Households Project back in the day. All of that kind of informed the research. But I think it's really important to kind of say, this was a long project. It didn't sort of, it was a 20-year project, but it was a 6-year project. So, at some points I did have to make decisions and go, not going there.
For sure. No, that's really useful. Okay, we've got a question from Philippa in the Q&A, who says, I'm particularly interested in grey nomads, retirees who travel. And she's wondering if any of your interviews hit the road or if their retirement allowed for mobile caring responsibilities, such as traveling to see grandkids.
Yeah, Pip, I love your work on the grey nomads. At one point, I think I had proposed, I would love to do a postdoc or something on grey nomads, just because really I wanted to get out of here. But you were already doing it, it turns out. But yeah, there was plenty of, there was the caravan often. There was the adaptation of the caravan quite often. So there was lots of DIYing going on with the van. They certainly hit the road often for longish periods of time. But there was definitely a lot of whinging as well about the fact that they couldn't hit the road because they were locked into term time and school holidays and caring for grandchildren. So absolutely all of what you mentioned, I think there was a real sense of wanting to travel, but sometimes being sort of locked down by those caring responsibilities. And it was a real tension. Yeah, absolutely. I feel like we probably shared many of the same participants, Pip.
Definitely some questions, some conversations.
Yeah.
Sure. Yes, and Pip says my interviewees too. Let's go publish. Good idea. Mark asks or says, thank you very much for your talk, really interesting. He says your data shows quite interesting differences in post-retirement activities between males and females. And his question is, how are their activities different or similar to those of retired steel and manufacturing workers in other countries, or the early generations of retired steel and manufacturing workers in Australia? So kind of a spatial and generational differences.
It's not something, I've got to be open, it's not something that I looked at in this project. It's an interesting question, and I've often clutched onto that. I use I tend to use, in this project, I certainly used a feminist framework, and that idea of focusing in on the everyday life and those everyday material relationships. A couple of days ago, I read a really good it was a blog post, I think, on the PPE, the Sydney PPE blog, that really made the argument that, quite strongly, that if you're not connecting that kind of perspective to a much broader political economic perspective, that there's a bit of a gap there. And I have, I think for the first time it actually hit me that that I do need to probably look at, those different scalar relationships. So I feel like it's something that I've argued more stridently against it's kind of a version of you don't know what you don't know. I was much more vocal about not caring about the bigger picture as a more junior academic. The more I go on, the more I think, I can't really just focus on this everyday life thing. I really do need to connect it to those bigger questions of, how this has played out over history. So yes, I think it points to a gap, one that I'm aware of and trying to pick up on going forward.
Thanks, that's a great reflection. A question from Alex, who says, thanks Chantal, this was really great. Were the participants former union members when they were in work? And if so, do you think this had impacts or strengthened even their social bonds?
Yeah, what I think is really interesting is that they all would have been unionised as trades workers, so working on the tools. This is something that's a lot of people, perhaps it's not so clear unless you research industrial work. So at a supervisory, so you probably have 3 moves. You have within the steel plant, you would be a trades worker, a repair and maintenance worker, an electrician or a fitter or a boilermaker, something like that. You would become a leading hand, which meant that you would kind of lead a work crew, but you'd still be on the tools. or you'd become a supervisor. And when you move to becoming a supervisor, it's kind of like that jump to head of school, I imagine, where you're just kind of making the leap over the fence, and all of a sudden your colleagues, you're kind of in a management role. So all of these workers would have spent at least, probably at least 10 years of the first 10 years, maybe 15 years of their working lives in unions, in a fully unionized workplace during, the 60s and 70s. So high rates of union membership. But once they made that leap, as I think 16 out of the 18 did, to that sort of frontline supervisory role, very much kind of frontline and still managing, still frontline sort of on the tools occasionally when they had to be, still very much out there on the plant. But the nature of the employment relationship shifts just slightly. And so they're no longer unionized as part of that. So I think what it speaks to there is that idea of solidarity, sharing, that kind of social infrastructure provided by the unions, it almost, I don't want to say this because no one actually sort of spoke really openly about it, but it almost becomes embodied, that idea of the collective. And, I think through long periods of being kind of in that sort of mindset, it almost becomes embodied, and that jump to being a frontline supervisor, it's not easy. All of those participants spoke a lot about, what happens when one day you're part of the crew and the next day you're trying to manage people who were your colleagues yesterday. And I think there's a lot, particularly, and I'll get back to those political economic critiques here, but there's a lot to be said for going into the workplace through the lens of unions, which is important, but sort of not really recognizing that there are all kinds of relationships in the everyday that are a lot blurrier, that aren't so straightforward, that are a lot more complex and nuanced and ambivalent. I really do think that idea of sort of collectivism and strong social bonds is right at the heart of this, that comes from a heavily unionized environment. But no, 16 out of 18 participants weren't union members at the time that they retired.
That's really, really interesting. And again, kind of brings that political economy and the, cultural geography concern for embodiment together in a really interesting way.
I think, David, we've spoken a little bit about this, but there's so much that cultural geographers can say about work because of those, that lens of embodiment and the different, I guess the different ways in. I think there'd be part of what I'm trying to put together for IAG is around that argument, that there's a lot that cultural geographers have to add in the space of work. I think it's almost, this is going to be, oh gosh, we're recording, but I feel like there's something to be said that work is too important a sphere of everyday life to kind of leave to one domain of geography, to leave to economic geographers. We all need to be thinking about work.
I couldn't agree more, and very much looking forward to hearing your keynote. So we've got a question from Ilan, who says, such a great paper. Were there any types of care work your participants did not feel comfortable to do?
Changing nappies. Very, very vocally. Their sense of materiality and material skill didn't lend itself to nappy changing. Yeah.
A part of their life they probably thought they'd left behind a long time ago, maybe.
Well, actually, that they'd never participated in the first place.
Yeah.
So, they quite openly said, I don't have the skills in that space, even though they were prepared to learn the skills in other domains like cooking. Yeah.
Think about our lines. Just a follow-up question from Pip, who asked, does your work have anything to say about Australian national identity?
I don't know. I no, because I think even in the 10 years since I started this project, and it ran for a long time, I think we're in a whole different space about Australian national identity and what that means. I think it says something about, old white working class men, which, has, you could say, has dominated sort of mainstream ideas about Australian national identity, but I'm really cautious about, you know, about pursuing that, because I think it's really problematic.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I wonder if I could be cheeky and use the chair's prerogative to ask a final question before I bring today's seminar to a conclusion, which is, I guess I was really struck by the I suppose the kind of the affirmation that you presented. You know, it was in part a really inspiring paper, because these were all people who had developed new skills. They were actively using their social relationships, and you know, there was an awful lot of really, really inspiring and positive things going on here. And then towards the end, we almost had a kind of a gear change to think about some of those burdens of care, the aging bodies and childcare that you mentioned. And I guess that draws attention to a whole other set of things around things that people have already asked in the questions, I guess, around you know, the difficulties of care, uncaring, you know, things to do with being ungenerous, I guess. And so I suppose I wonder if I could pose this as I guess a methodological but also an analytical question about how you sit with making some of those choices that we all have to do in our research in terms of the stories that we ultimately want to tell. You know, was the kind of more affirmative focus something that was just a reflection of people's disposition in interviews, or was it more a product of your own analytical choices and what you wanted to sort of stage and showcase to maybe kind of push back on some of those discourses that your project is sets itself up sort of to contrast? So it's a really kind of rambly and not well-formed question, but I hope you sort of see what I'm getting at there.
Yeah, God, now to avoid a really rambly and not thought through answer. Yeah, look, I think there's probably, there's a couple of things that play there. I think going through, going, you know, in the moment, in the project, there was certainly I guess, a commitment to opening up that dialogue with industrial workers, kind of recognising, you know, trying to, so certainly a sense of trying to look for the positives in some way. Certainly in a longer thesis, you get a lot more space to unpack some of the more critical elements of it. And I would regularly have conversations with Jessie Adams-Steen, who's a design historian at UTS. We were kind of studying trades workers, often male trades workers. I'm one of few not, but we would often kind of go, oh, how like we can't cope with this anymore. How, you know, you would often hear, I would often hear things that sort of didn't gel with what I wanted to hear. They all ended up in the broader thesis, but yeah, I haven't presented them today. And I guess part of it was actually in this paper was coming to you in the moment, I think, and recognizing, I think, look, part of me was trying to respond to the fact that all of you in Melbourne are locked down, and I think outside of Melbourne have no idea. So, you know, what that feels like sort of 4 times round. Part of me just wanted to present a good news story today on the day. Is that cheeky? Is that too much? I just kind of wanted to focus on the moments of potential rather than being critical, because I think, you know, being critical, sometimes we've all gone down the spiral of late. So a bit of a decision in the moment.
No, thank you so much, Chantal, and that's a really generous generous thing to do for us as well. Thank you very much to everyone for your great questions, and thanks to Chantal for such eloquent, beautiful, and comprehensive answers to each of those. It really kind of forced me to think about so many aspects of the talk further. And thank you too for giving us such an inspiring paper to get our teeth into. It's been a real pleasure to host you here in the school. We're really looking forward to hearing your keynote at the IAG, and we wish you all the very best for your DECRA project, and we hope that you will come back to the school and maybe even in person, hopefully in a few years' time, and share with us how your research in that regard is travelling. So thank you very much. Please do join us again, everyone, for our next seminar and final seminar of the series, which is actually, it's a double bill week. So we're having another seminar this Thursday at 3:30, and that will be presented by Christian Edwards. So please do join us for that. But finally, thank you, Chantal, once again. It's been a real pleasure, and thank you very much for coming.
Thanks, David. Terrific set of questions, everyone, and a joy to be in Melbourne, if not in Melbourne.